In addition to the biological theories of the causes of depressive disorders and the biological approaches to treatment for depressive disorders, there are also psychosocial theories that address potential causes for depressive disorders and suggest different types of psychosocial treatments for those depressive disorders. So, when it comes to some of those theories. Some of those are from a cognitive behavioral perspective. And cognitive behavioral theorists suggest that there are a number or potentially a number of cognitive and or behavioral issues that may contribute to the development of depressive disorders. Things like rewards and punishments, thinking patterns, and a pattern that's known as learned helplessness. From the behavioral model suggests that depression for some people may result from changes in rewards and punishments that they receive in their lives. And so it's been suggested that the positive rewards in life dwindle for some people as they get older, and that leads them to perform fewer constructive behaviors. And as a result, they start to spiral toward depression. It's also been suggested that negative thinking may play a role in the development of depressive disorders. So, cognitive behavioral therapists like Aaron Beck theorize that there are these cognitive components that combine to produce unipolar depression. According to Beck, four of those cognitive components are things like maladaptive attitudes, what he calls the cognitive triad, errors in thinking, and automatic thoughts. Those maladaptive attitudes are self-defeating attitudes that are developed during childhood. And Beck suggests that upsetting situations later in life can trigger an extended round of negative thinking. And in his view, that negative thinking typically takes three forms, what he called the cognitive triad. Individuals repeatedly, one, interpret their experiences, two, interpret themselves, and three, interpret their futures in negative ways. And so this cognitive triad, in his view, then leads to depression. It's also been suggested that people who experience depressive disorders may experience errors in their thinking. And a couple of those errors in thinking might include things like arbitrary inferences, or automatic thoughts, or I'm sorry, minimization. Arbitrary inferences might be things like, she didn't smile at me, so she must not like me. So, without any information, making an inference based on just one little piece of information. And then minimization involves minimization of the positive and magnification of the negative. So a person may have a number of different things in their life that are positive, but they tend to minimize those while putting much more emphasis on the negative or the unpleasant stuff. It's also suggested that depressed people may experience automatic thoughts, a steady train of unpleasant thoughts that suggest inadequacy and hopelessness. So these thoughts come to the person automatically, and they suggest to the person that he or she is inadequate, that they're incompetent, and that their situation is hopeless and that nothing can be done. Now, from a cognitive perspective, another approach is the approach that involves learned helplessness. And learned helplessness is the perception based on past experience that a person has no control over the rewards and punishments that they experience. Martin Seligman suggested that people experience learned helplessness when they've been placed in situations in which they have no control over what happens to them. He argued that eventually they get to a point where, even in situations where they do have some control, they stop even trying to exert that control. So, sort of a why bother kind of attitude. And he further suggested that when people experience learned helplessness, they're more likely to experience depression. A revised version of the learned helplessness model is what's known as the attribution helplessness theory. And this model suggests that when people experience no control, they try to figure out why this is the case. So it's to what they attribute that lack of control that proponents of this model think makes the difference with depression. They suggest that feelings of helplessness and, in turn, depression are greater when people attribute their lack of control to internal factors that they believe are global and stable, as opposed to external factors that are situation specific and temporary. So, in terms of internal factors, people with depression might be more likely to say or to attribute that lack of control to something within themselves, something about their character, their personality, or their disposition. And so they may believe that those things are global in nature, that they encompass pretty much everything, and that they're pretty stable long term. But the opposite of that would be attributing that lack of control to external factors, something in the situation. So, something that rather than being global is situation specific, and rather than being more stable in nature, more permanent, um, something that is a bit more temporary. So the internal global stable attributions may lead to a sense of hopelessness and the development of learned helplessness, which may then in turn develop into depression. So, what does treatment look like from a cognitive behavioral perspective? Well, when it comes to some of those behavioral causes or things that have been suggested as behavioral causes, a lack of reinforcers in one's environment, a type of treatment that is often used is what's called behavioral activation. And there are three goals of behavioral activation: to reintroduce the person to pleasurable events and activities. So, to get them to re engage in some different events and activities in their community. And then, secondly, to consistently reward non depressive behaviors and withhold rewards for depressive behaviors. So, if the individual gets a lot of attention from family members or a lot of support from family members when they are depressed, it could be that that attention is a reward or a reinforcement. So, they would suggest that it would be much more helpful to withhold those rewards. So to withhold that attention as a way to maybe extinguish the depressive behaviors. And then a third goal is to help improve social skills. So the person may not be engaging in some of those events and activities because they have some concerns about their ability to do so, their ability to interact socially. And so a third goal is to help them work on those social skills a little bit. Now, treatment for depressive disorders from a more cognitively based approach typically has four phases: increasing activities and elevating mood, challenging those automatic thoughts, identifying negative thinking and biases, and changing those primary attitudes. So, increasing activities, getting people out there and involved in more things than they may have been involved in before or after the depression or the depressive symptoms started, because it's believed that just getting them out in the community and participating in activities might help to elevate the mood a little bit. But at the same time, cognitive therapists are probably going to work to challenge some of those automatic thoughts that the person has. So if they have these automatic thoughts that suggest that they are bad or that they are incompetent or whatever, the therapist, after they sort of identify what those thoughts are, would help that person to challenge those automatic thoughts. And then identifying the negative thinking and the biases. So helping that person figure out what some of their negative thought patterns are, what some of their unproductive biases in thinking might be, and then helping them to change those things. And then finally, changing one's primary attitudes about themselves, about their situation, and about their environment.